There are some burdens you were never created to carry, yet somewhere along the journey you convinced yourself that if you held on tighter, if you worried longer, if you stayed awake another night, somehow everything would be okay. You carried the weight of broken relationships. You carried the fear of tomorrow. You carried the guilt of yesterday. You carried expectations that were never yours to fulfill. And little by little, what began as a temporary burden became a permanent prison. But can I remind you of something today? God never asked you to be your own savior. He never called you to carry the weight that only his shoulders were designed to bear. The reason you're exhausted isn't because you're weak. It's because you've been carrying what heaven never assigned to you. Maybe today you're smiling on the outside while silently falling apart on the inside. Maybe you've prayed before, but the answers didn't come when you expected them. Maybe you've become so accustomed to carrying the pain that you've forgotten what freedom even feels like. But this message is your reminder that God is still inviting you to let go. Not because your struggles aren't real, not because your tears don't matter, but because his strength has always been greater than your struggle. Today, we're talking about let God carry what you never meant to carry. If your heart feels heavy, if your soul feels tired, if you've been trying to hold together pieces that only God can restore, then don't leave this message early, because before this is over, I believe you'll discover that surrender is not giving up. It's finally giving God permission to do what only he can do. There comes a moment in life when you have to ask yourself a difficult question. Who told me I had to carry all of this? Somewhere between trying to be strong for everyone else, trying to meet expectations, trying to fix every broken situation, and trying to control every possible outcome, many of us quietly accepted responsibilities that God never asked us to bear. We picked up burdens that slowly became part of our identity. We convinced ourselves that if we just tried harder, worried more, or sacrificed enough, everything would eventually fall into place. But instead of finding peace, we found exhaustion. Instead of finding security, we found anxiety. Instead of feeling closer to God, we often felt overwhelmed by the very weight we refused to put down. The truth is that not every burden you're carrying belongs to you. Some of the weight you're feeling comes from trying to control people you cannot change. Some of it comes from reliving mistakes that God has already forgiven. Some comes from fearing a future that hasn't even happened yet. Others carry the expectations of family, friends, society, or even their own impossible standards. Little by little, those burdens stack on top of one another until your heart feels heavy before the day has even begun. God never intended for his children to live under that kind of pressure. He never designed your soul to survive on endless stress and constant fear. He created you to walk with him, not ahead of him. Yet so often we rush in front of God, trying to solve problems before we've sought his wisdom. We exhaust ourselves trying to open doors that only he can unlock. We lose sleep over situations that are already in his hands, even when we cannot see it. Think about how often you replay conversations in your mind, wondering what you should have said differently. Think about the nights you've spent worrying about tomorrow, creating imaginary problems before the day has even arrived. Think about the emotional energy you've invested in trying to earn acceptance, prove your worth, or keep everyone around you happy. Those invisible burdens are just as heavy as physical ones, and over time they rob you of joy, peace, and hope. Sometimes we mistake carrying heavy burdens for being responsible. We think that if we're constantly stressed, we're being faithful. We assume that if we're exhausted, we're working hard enough. But faith is not measured by how much weight you can carry. Faith is measured by how willing you are to trust God with what you cannot control. There is a difference between being responsible and trying to replace God. Responsibility means doing your part. Trying to replace God means believing everything depends on you. How freeing would it be to admit that you don't have all the answers? How peaceful would it feel to acknowledge that you were never expected to? God's strength was never meant to be your backup plan. It was always meant to be your first source of confidence. The moment you recognize that some battles are beyond your ability is not the moment you failed. It's the moment you create room for God to work in ways you never could. Many people spend years carrying guilt over decisions they cannot undo. They replay old failures, wishing they could rewrite the story. But guilt that keeps you trapped is not from God. Conviction leads you toward healing, while endless shame keeps you chained to yesterday. If God has offered forgiveness, Why are you still carrying the weight of what he has already released? Others carry fear because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. They want every answer before taking the next step. They want guarantees before trusting God. But faith has never required complete visibility. Faith often means walking forward while trusting that God already sees what you cannot. Every step doesn't have to make sense before you move. Sometimes obedience comes before understanding. You may also be carrying the opinions of people who never had the authority to define your worth. Words spoken over you years ago may still echo in your mind, convincing you that you're not enough, not capable, or not worthy of God's best. But your identity was never meant to be built on human approval. It was always meant to be rooted in God's truth. When you carry other people's opinions, you eventually become too tired to hear God's voice. Imagine what your life could look like if you finally released the burdens you were never designed to carry. Imagine waking up without constantly rehearsing your fears. Imagine trusting God enough to stop trying to control every outcome. Imagine discovering that peace doesn't come from having every answer, but from knowing the one who does. The weight you've been carrying may feel familiar, but familiar doesn't always mean it's meant for you. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply placing your burdens in God's hands and believing that his shoulders are strong enough to carry what yours never were. Fear has a quiet way of entering your life. It rarely announces itself with a loud voice. Instead, it slips into your thoughts one small question at a time. What if this doesn't work out? What if I lose everything? What if I'm not enough? Before long, those questions begin to shape your decisions. You hesitate when you should move forward. You remain silent when you should speak. You hold back when God is calling you to step out in faith. Fear doesn't always stop you from living completely, but it often convinces you to live beneath the life God intended for you. The dangerous thing about fear is that it grows wherever faith is neglected. Just as a garden fills with weeds when it is left unattended, the heart becomes crowded with fear when it is no longer nourished by God's truth. Every day you are feeding something. You are either feeding your faith or feeding your fear. If your thoughts are constantly focused on worst-case scenarios, disappointment, failure, and uncertainty, fear begins to feel stronger than God's promises. But when your heart is filled with his word, his character, and his faithfulness, fear slowly loses its grip. Many of the battles we fight never happen around us. They happen within us. They happen in the quiet conversations we have with ourselves when no one else is listening. Sometimes your greatest enemy isn't the obstacle in front of you. It's the voice inside you that keeps saying, you can't do this. That voice reminds you of every mistake you've made, every opportunity you've missed, and every time life didn't go according to plan. It tries to convince you that your future will look exactly like your past. But God has never been limited by your history. He specializes in creating new beginnings where people only expect repeated failures. Fear has a way of making temporary situations feel permanent. One difficult season can convince you that your whole life will always be this way. One closed door can make you believe no other opportunities exist. One disappointment can persuade you that hope is dangerous. But feelings are not facts, and fear is often built upon assumptions instead of truth. Just because you cannot see the solution today does not mean God has stopped working. There are countless moments when heaven is arranging what your eyes cannot yet perceive. Think about the disciples during the storm. The waves were real, the wind was real, the danger was real, but so was the presence of Jesus in the boat. Their fear caused them to focus more on the storm than on the one who had power over it. How often do we do the same? We stare at the size of our problems until they appear greater than the God we serve. We measure our circumstances instead of measuring God's faithfulness. We calculate every possible affair while forgetting every prayer he has already answered. Faith does not pretend that storms don't exist. Faith simply believes that God remains Lord over every storm. It acknowledges the difficulty without surrendering to despair. It admits the uncertainty while refusing to abandon hope. Fear says you're alone. Faith says God is with you. Fear says you'll never recover. Faith says God restores what seems impossible. Fear says you have to figure everything out. Faith says God is already making a way. Sometimes fear disguises itself as wisdom. We call it being realistic. We say we're just protecting ourselves from disappointment. We avoid taking risks because failure feels safer than hope. But there is a difference between wisdom and fear. Wisdom listens to God's direction. Fear listens only to possibilities of failure. Wisdom moves carefully with confidence. Fear refuses to move at all. One is rooted in trust, the other is rooted in doubt. You were never called to live a life controlled by endless what ifs. If you spend every day worrying about tomorrow, you will miss the grace God has provided for today. Fear steals today's peace by making you live in tomorrow's uncertainty. Yet God gives strength one day at a time. He doesn't ask you to carry next month's burdens today. He simply invites you to trust Him with this moment, believing that the same God who has sustained you this far will continue to lead you tomorrow. When fear begins speaking louder than your faith, remember everything God has already brought you through. There were seasons you thought would break you, yet here you are. There were prayers you thought would never be answered, yet God made a way. There were moments when you couldn't imagine surviving another day, yet His grace carried you through every single one. Your testimony is evidence that fear has lied to you before, and it will lie again if you allow it. The answer is not to become fearless by your own strength. The answer is to become so convinced of God's character that fear no longer has the final word. The more you know who God is, the less power fear has over your future. His love reminds you that you are never abandoned. His promises remind you that He is always faithful. His presence reminds you that you never face life's battles alone. When faith begins to speak louder than fear, your circumstances may not change overnight, but your perspective will. And sometimes a changed perspective is the very beginning of a changed life. Surrender is one of those words that sounds simple until life demands it from you. It feels easy to talk about trusting God when things are going well, when answers come quickly, when doors open without resistance. But surrender becomes real in the moments when nothing makes sense, when prayers seem unanswered, and when holding on feels safer than letting go. In those moments, surrender is not a concept. It becomes a struggle between what you can control and what you must release. Many people misunderstand surrender as weakness. They think letting go means giving up, quitting, or admitting defeat. But surrender in the hands of God is not about loss. It is about alignment. It is the decision to stop exhausting yourself trying to carry what was never meant to be yours, and instead placing it into the hands of the one who has never failed you. There is a quiet strength in saying, I cannot do this alone anymore. That moment is not the end of your effort. It is the beginning of divine help stepping in where human strength runs out. You have probably experienced what it feels like to hold on too tightly. You try to fix relationships that are falling apart. You try to force outcomes that refuse to move in your favor. You replay conversations, rethink decisions, and carry the weight of outcomes that are not even in your control. And the more you tighten your grip, the more exhausted your spirit becomes. It is as if your soul is constantly running but never arriving. That exhaustion is often a sign that you are trying to play a role only God can fulfill. Surrender does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop controlling. There is a difference between loving something deeply and trying to manage it perfectly. God never asked you to be the manager of every outcome. He asked you to trust Him with what you cannot see. Yet many times we confuse anxiety for responsibility. We believe that if we stop worrying, everything will fall apart. But worry has never solved a single problem. It only convinces you that you are in charge of things you were never meant to handle. True surrender requires courage because it forces you to confront your need for control. It asks you to admit that your understanding is limited, your strength is finite, and your perspective is incomplete. And that is uncomfortable for the human heart. We like certainty. We like knowing how things will end. But faith was never designed to give you all the details. Faith was designed to guide you step by step. Even when the full path is hidden, there is something powerful that happens when you finally release what you have been holding onto for too long. At first, it feels like loss. You may feel vulnerable, uncertain, even exposed. But slowly, something shifts within you. The weight that once felt unbearable is no longer pressing on your soul. And in that space where anxiety used to live, peace begins to take its place. Not because the situation changed immediately, but because your posture toward it has changed. God does not rush to take control from you. He waits for you to invite Him into what you are struggling to manage. He stands ready, not forcing His way in, but gently calling you to trust Him. And every time you choose surrender over striving, you are not losing power. You are transferring it to the only one who can actually bring restoration. Surrender is also an ongoing process, not a one-time decision. There are moments when you will take things back into your own hands without realizing it. Worry will creep in, fear will return, old habits of control will resurface, but each time you are invited again to release it. God does not reject you for struggling to surrender. He patiently teaches you how to trust Him deeper each time you return to Him. The beauty of surrender is that it opens the door for God to work in ways you could never orchestrate. What feels like letting go is actually making room. When your hands are full of control, anxiety, and pressure, there is no space left for peace, guidance, or divine intervention. But when you empty your hands, you discover that what you release is nothing compared to what God places back into your life. Surrender is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of God revealing how strong He has been all along. It is where your limitations meet His unlimited power and where your exhaustion meets His endless strength. And in that exchange, something beautiful begins to unfold that you could never achieve by holding on tighter. Grace is one of those truths that sounds beautiful in theory, but becomes life-changing when you are no longer strong enough to carry yourself. There comes a point where your best effort runs out, where your energy is depleted, where your emotional reserves feel empty, and you begin to realize that willpower alone cannot heal what is happening inside of you. And in that space where striving ends, grace begins to reveal itself in a way that is not just comforting, but sustaining. So many people live as if their survival depends entirely on their ability to keep everything together. They wake up already thinking about what could go wrong. They move through their days trying to anticipate problems before they happen. They replay their failures, measure their worth by their productivity, and silently carry the belief that if they stop holding everything in place, everything will collapse. That kind of living is not strength, even though it may look like it from the outside. It is exhaustion disguised as responsibility. Grace interrupts that pattern. It steps into the places where effort is no longer enough and reminds you that you never meant to be your own source of strength. There is a kind of peace that does not come from having all the answers, but from knowing that you are held even when you do not. That peace often begins to show up in the very moments you feel most overwhelmed, when your thoughts are racing, when your heart feels heavy, when your mind is trying to solve problems that feel too big for you. Grace does not ask you to perform better. It invites you to rest deeper. There is a misconception that grace is passive, that it only comforts but does not carry. But grace is not inactivity. It is divine support in motion. It is what keeps you steady when your emotions are unstable. It is what keeps you grounded when your circumstances are shifting. It is what sustains you when your strength would otherwise fail. And often it works quietly in ways you may not recognize at first. It shows up as unexpected peace in a stressful moment. It shows up as resilience you did not consciously generate. It shows up as doors not closing when they easily could have. Many people try to earn their way into peace as if rest must be deserved. They believe that only after they have done enough, fixed enough, or proven enough will they be allowed to feel safe. But grace does not operate on performance. It operates on love. And that love does not increase or decrease based on how well you are holding things together. In fact, it often becomes more evident when you are no longer able to pretend that you are fine on your own. There is something deeply humbling about reaching the end of your own strength. Not in a way that shames you, but in a way that strips away the illusion of control. Because control is often what keeps people from experiencing grace fully. As long as you believe you can manage everything on your own, you will continue to lean on your own understanding. But when life exposes the limits of your ability, it also creates space for something greater to step in. Grace meets you in places you would rather hide, in the mistakes you replay in your mind, in the regrets you thought disqualified you. In the moments where you feel like you should have known better or done better, instead of condemning you, grace covers you. Instead of pushing you away, it draws you closer. It does not ignore accountability, but it refuses to define you by your worst moments. It gives you permission to begin again, even when you do not feel ready. There are days when even praying feels heavy, when words do not come easily, when your heart is too tired to articulate what you need. And even then, grace remains active. It is not dependent on your ability to express yourself perfectly. It is present in your silence as much as in your speech. It holds you steady when you cannot hold yourself together, and it continues working in ways you cannot yet see or fully understand right now. Because what you are carrying feels heavier than anything you planned for when you first stepped into this season, and everything around you seems to be asking for more than you currently have to give while still. Waiting is often one of the hardest places to live in because it forces you to exist in the tension between what you believe and what you can see. You believe that God is working, but your circumstances do not always confirm it. You believe that change is coming, but the delay makes you question the timing. You believe that prayers are being heard, but silence can feel louder than any answer you were expecting. And in that silence, doubt tries to rewrite the story of your faith. There is something deeply uncomfortable about not knowing when things will shift. Human nature wants clarity. It wants schedules, deadlines, and visible progress.
Right.
But God rarely operates according to human timelines. He works in ways that stretch your patience while strengthening your trust. And in those stretching seasons, many people begin to feel as if nothing is happening, when in reality, something unseen is being formed beneath the surface of their lives. What you often call delay is not always denial. Sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes it is protection. Sometimes it is alignment. There are things God is orchestrating that require more than your immediate understanding. And if He were to reveal everything at once, it might overwhelm what you are currently able to carry. So instead, He gives you enough light for the next step, not the entire map for the journey. Trusting God's timing means learning to release your internal clock and surrender it to His wisdom. It means accepting that just because something has not happened yet does not mean it will never happen. It also means understanding that the value of what God is building in you is often revealed in the waiting process itself. Patience is not passive. It is active trust. It is the daily decision to believe that God is still good, still present, and still working, even when nothing around you seems to change. Many people lose peace in the waiting because they measure progress only by visible outcomes. They look for doors opening, situations improving, or problems resolving. But God often measures progress differently. He looks at your heart. He looks at your character. He looks at your ability to trust Him when the outcome is uncertain. In that sense, waiting is not wasted time. It is shaping time. It is where your faith is refined and your dependence on Him becomes deeper and more genuine. There are moments in life when you may feel forgotten because of how long you have been waiting. You may see others moving forward while you feel stuck in the same place. You may wonder why their answers came quickly while yours seemed delayed. But comparison rarely brings clarity. It only increases frustration. God's timing for your life is not less important because it is different. It is uniquely designed for what He is preparing you to step into. Think of how often in your life things made sense only after they happened. Situations that once felt like setbacks later revealed themselves as redirections. Closed doors that once caused disappointment later protected you from something you were not ready for. Delays that once frustrated you later became evidence of God's unseen protection. This is why hindsight often reveals what impatience cannot see in the moment. Waiting also exposes what you truly rely on. When everything is immediate and predictable, it is easy to believe you have control. But when answers are delayed, you begin to see where your trust truly rests. If peace disappears the moment outcomes are uncertain, it reveals that peace was not anchored in God, but in circumstances. True trust grows when circumstances shift, but your confidence in God remains steady. There is a quiet strength that develops in those who learn to wait with hope instead of anxiety. They may not have all the answers, but they refuse to give up on the one who holds the answers. They learn to breathe through uncertainty, to pray through silence, and to remain steady even when nothing seems to be changing. And over time, something powerful happens within them. Their waiting becomes less about frustration and more about formation. God is never late, even when it feels like He is taking too long. His timing is not based on human urgency, but on perfect wisdom. What feels delayed in your life is still under divine management. And even in seasons where you cannot see progress, you are still being held, still being guided, still being prepared for what is ahead, while your heart learns to trust that there is a moment in every journey where you realize that carrying things for too long has changed the way you live. What once felt temporary begins to feel normal. The weight you were supposed to release starts to shape your identity. You become accustomed to stress, familiar with pressure, and almost comfortable with the heaviness you were never meant to hold. But freedom always begins with awareness. And awareness begins when you finally recognize that you were not created to live bound by what God already gave you permission to release. Walking forward free is not always dramatic. It does not always feel like a sudden breakthrough or an instant change in circumstances. Often it begins quietly in the heart when you make a decision that you will no longer carry what God has already asked you to lay down. It is in that internal shift where something begins to loosen. The grip of fear weakens. The cycle of overthinking starts to lose its control. The constant pressure to fix everything slowly begins to fade. Many people remain stuck not because their situation has not changed, but because their mindset has not shifted. They keep dragging yesterday into today, rehearsing old pain, replaying old conversations, and reliving old disappointments. But forward movement requires release. You cannot walk into what God has prepared for you while still holding on to what He has already rescued you from. At some point, you must choose between holding on and moving forward because both cannot coexist. Freedom often feels unfamiliar at first. When you have lived under pressure for a long time, peace can feel strange. When you have been anxious for years, stillness can feel uncomfortable. When you have been trying to control everything, surrender can feel like loss. But what feels unfamiliar is not always unsafe. Sometimes it is simply new. And newness is often where God begins to rebuild what heaviness tried to destroy. There's a difference between being free and feeling free. Feeling free is emotional and can fluctuate. Being free is a deeper reality that remains even when emotions change. You may not always feel light immediately after letting go, but something has already shifted in the spiritual space around you. The chains may no longer be visible, but the decision you made has already begun to reshape your direction. Walking forward free also means learning to stop revisiting places God has already closed. It means resisting the temptation to reopen conversations that were meant to end. It means no longer giving emotional access to things that were designed to stay in your past. Every time you return to what God has released you from, you delay your own healing. But every time you choose to move forward, you reinforce the truth that your future is more valuable than your past. There is also a level of courage required to walk in freedom, because freedom challenges familiarity. Even unhealthy patterns can feel comfortable simply because they are known. But God does not call you into comfort zones. He calls you into growth. And growth often requires stepping away from what feels safe but is spiritually limiting. You cannot embrace new life while clinging to old cycles. At some point, trust must outweigh familiarity. As you begin to walk forward, you may notice that not everything around you changes immediately. Some situations may still look the same. Some answers may still be delayed, but your posture will be different. You will no longer walk with the same weight on your shoulders. You will no longer interpret every challenge as a sign of defeat. Instead, you begin to see yourself as someone who is being led, not someone who is lost. Freedom also brings clarity. When you are no longer consumed by what you cannot control, you begin to see what truly matters. You stop wasting energy on what drains you and start investing it in what strengthens you. Your perspective shifts from survival to purpose. You begin to understand that your life is not defined by what you escaped, but by where God is leading you. And as you continue forward, something deeper takes root within you. Peace becomes more consistent. Joy becomes less dependent on circumstances. Faith becomes more grounded. You begin to realize that the freedom you were searching for externally was always meant to be established internally first. And once that internal freedom is secured, everything else begins to align around it while your steps continue forward.